This is a story of the resurrected Jesus and one of the occasions in which he appeared to his disciples. Later, Jesus himself appeared again to his disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, also known as Galilee. This is how it happened. Simon Peter, Thomas called Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, Zebedee's sons, and 2 other disciples were together. Simon Peter told them, "I'm going fishing." They said, "We'll go with you." They set out in a boat, but throughout the night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples didn't realize it was Jesus. Jesus called to them, "Children, have you caught anything to eat?" They answered him, "No." He said, "Cast your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they did, and there were so many fish that they couldn't haul in the net. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It's the Lord." When Simon Peter heard it was the Lord, he wrapped his coat around himself, for he was naked, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they weren't far from shore, only about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire there with fish on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you've just caught." Simon Peter got up and pulled the net to shore. It was full of large fish, 153 of them. Yet the net hadn't torn, even with so many fish. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples could bring themselves to ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread, and gave it to them. He did the same with the fish. This was now the 3rd time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they finished eating, Jesus asked Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Simon replied, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." Jesus asked a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Simon replied, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." Jesus said to him, "Take care of my sheep." He asked a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was sad that Jesus asked him a third time, "Do you love me?" He replied, "Lord, you know everything. You know I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. I assure you that when you were younger, you tied your own belt and walked around wherever you wanted. When you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will be your belt and lead you where you don't want to go." He said this to show the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. After saying this, Jesus said to Peter, "Follow me." This is the gospel of Christ.
Thanks to God for grace and truth. The men in particular had been hungry, so it wasn't long before all the fish got eaten. And now they sat there quietly, looking out at the lake. No one was speaking, and there were several reasons for this. First of all, they were digesting. The bread they had with them was made just yesterday, and it was grainy and heavy and very flavorful. And the fish, it could not have been fresher. And Bartholomew was there, and he was an expert on roasting fish over fire. There weren't any herbs or spices to add, which would have been nice, but the wood smoke added plenty of flavor, and the fish was flaky and even a little bit sweet. And there had been plenty of them. 153 fish will feed a lot of people. James had counted them like he always used to do when they brought in their catch to sell. You know, old habits. So they were all full and content and quiet. And the lake was silencing them. Maybe you know about this. Fire and water make a person feel quiet and content. We seem to get a bit hypnotized by embers and ripples. It's probably an old primitive thing deep in our brains. When we have water and fire, we are safe. We can relax. We can stop wandering and looking. We have warmth. We have safety. We have plenty to drink. And nothing else is quite as necessary as that. So when we build our fires in our wood stoves and our fire pits, we sit there with some sort of drink and we start to dream. Our souls seem to float a bit when we sit by the fire or by the water. So it was with this small group of people gathered around that fire. It was crackling. Driftwood always crackles because it's so dry. It releases a fragrant smoke that on this particular morning was rising straight up in a graceful white column, like a prayer. Like their prayers they weren't even aware that they were saying, prayers that were coming from their floating souls. In the changing, glowing embers of the fire, they saw shapes and pictures and memories. And the lake was calm that morning. They had all known the lake to be angry and dangerous. They'd been out in it together, many of them, but this morning it was soft and friendly. The opposite shore was perfectly reflected. You could make out individual rocks on the other side and then see them reflected in the water, upside down. And as the sun came up over those hills on the other side, on the eastern shore, the air stirred a bit. A few ripples began to form. The tree they'd been sitting under sighed a welcome to the sun, and the leaves waved a little good morning hello. In that tree there were some sparrows chattering. Mary Magdalene noticed that another little bird, the bulbul they called it, with its black head and yellow belly and those funny white rings around its eyes. A group of them came through and landed in the tree and ate a few bugs and moved on. And Mary took a deep breath of that soft morning air and thought again how she wished she could fly. Ah, the scent of the lake in the morning. She'd grown up a few miles down the shoreline from where they sat, and she woke up every day of her childhood with the smell of the lake. Some people, it seemed to her, never really noticed it, but she always did. Every morning she would step outside and take a deep breath and pray her morning prayer. Hear, O Israel, the ruler your God, the ruler is one. And you shall love the sovereign God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And now that she had heard Jesus say the same prayer, she thanked God for letting her know this truth from the time she was very small. Except for those dark years, but those were over. She leaned back. The rising sun hit her face and warmed her. Also, no one was speaking because there was a big, fat, invisible ox among them, and they were all trying to ignore it. I'd say it was an elephant in the room, but none of them had ever seen an elephant, and probably never even a picture of one, and they weren't in a room. So instead of an elephant in the room, let's just talk about this ox sitting there by the fire. And it was this. They had all failed Jesus. They had run when he was arrested. Did they love him? Yes, they did. But when the police showed up in that dark garden outside the city, they ran off into the darkness. Later we are told Peter and John turned around and followed the torches right into the high priest's estate. And it was there that Peter did exactly what Jesus said he would do. Because a few hours earlier, while they sat at supper, Jesus had said that they would all run away when the time came. And they all said that they wouldn't. But Peter spoke for all of them, as he often did, and he said, I will die before I desert you. And Jesus had looked at him and said, Peter, before the rooster crows, you will say 3 times, you don't even know me. And that is exactly what Peter did. Right there in the courtyard, outside the place where Jesus was on trial, a trial in which Jesus could have been a witness for, where Peter should have been a witness for Jesus on the defense. And here he was outside saying, I don't even know who the man is. And he was swearing as he said it. So he was thinking about that while they all sat there by the lake. He wanted to confess. He wanted to admit. He wanted to apologize for what he had done. But how could he say it? I think it would come off like so many of the apologies we hear today in the news. Hey, Jesus, sorry about that running away thing. Or, Jesus, I'm sorry that all that had to happen. Or, Jesus, you know, I never meant to desert you. I was outside because I was trying to figure out what to do, and, well, things just got out of hand. So you ended up being crucified. Sorry about that. Now, Peter can't say anything like that, so he sat and he looked out at the lake, and he felt the breeze. And he blinked when the wind shifted a little bit and blew some smoke in his eyes, and tears formed, and they were followed by other tears that had nothing to do with the smoke. But he sat silently, just a few feet away from the one who had changed his life so much. Jesus stood up and walked a few feet down to the shore and waded in a little ways, wetting his sandals in the bottom of his robe. He came back and sat down again. The fire flared a little and then settled back into embers, and a gull landed on a rock a few feet off the shore and scolded them all. And then quietly Jesus said, Simon, do you love me more than these? These what? These other guys, these fish, these moments, that gull out there? Simon Peter didn't ponder that problem too much because he realized that no matter what Jesus was referring to, the answer was the same. Yes, Lord, you know I love you. And then Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again a silence. By now the sun is well up in the sky. Across the lake on top of the cliffs, there was actually a flock of sheep being led along. And this was not unusual. There were lots of shepherds there always. But right at this moment, when Jesus says this, the chattering flock of sparrows suddenly took off in a noisy burst. And then Jesus said, Simon, do you love me? Peter sat up straight. He paused a moment until Jesus looked up from where he had been stirring the fire with a stick. And then Peter said, yes, I love you. And Jesus said, take care of my sheep. And everyone looked up now wondering what was going on. And Mary realized what was happening, as did John. They glanced at each other and smiled and waited for what they knew was coming. A third question. Simon, do you love me? And now Peter is heartbroken. Did Jesus not understand? He must. Jesus had seen through Peter's bravado many times. He had pierced the heart of issues with authorities over and over, and he so often seemed to know exactly what was going to happen. And Peter was now crying openly and said, yes, Lord, you know everything. You know I love you. A pause. A long pause. And then Jesus said, feed my sheep. A raven flying over a tree nearby landed and let go with a series of harsh hoarse caws 3 times. 3 times. 3 times. And Peter understood. 3 times I said I didn't even know him. 3 times he asks if I love him. And 3 times I say that I do. And there was silence. An ember popped, a puff of wind from the lake ruffled the hair and clothing of the small group seated on the ground. Look at that, said one of the women there, and pointed. A group of white and yellow birds with black heads were rising and diving into the water out into the middle of the lake. Hey, James, she said, are you counting their catch? And everyone laughed. And Jesus stood and stretched. Come with me a little bit, Peter. And Jesus helped Peter to his feet, and Peter couldn't help but notice the hands that clasped his were horribly scarred. But Peter understood what was happening, and so did everyone there. Peter had been forgiven, and now he was reinstated. He was to be the leader of this group again. He knew what it was to fail and be forgiven. And then Jesus said quietly, Peter, when you were young, you got up and put your belt around your robe and you went wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will hold out your hands and someone else will put your belt around them and they will take you where you do not want to go. But you follow me. And Peter understood that he was to follow Jesus and the others would follow him and the world would change. The sun was well up now and the land was starting to make the heat. But here by the lake it was cool and calm. And Peter looked out at the blue sky and the blue water. One reflected the other. Each, water and sky, filled the world with light and air. And for the first time that day, Peter thought to himself, what a beautiful day this is. And why am I telling you this story? Because we have to remember, we must remember, we are a forgiven people. We are not here today because we are so good, and certainly not because we are perfect. We have failed in so many ways to love God and to love our neighbor. We have failed to love each other as Jesus commanded, but we are forgiven. Every morning the sun rises over the lakes of Maine. The birds sing, the fish jump, the children play, and some guy goes out water skiing at about 6:30 in the morning and wakes you up. That's okay. Forgive him, because you are also a forgiven person, so you can be a forgiver. It's who we are, people who know forgiveness. Amen.
You've been listening to a sermon by Reverend Stephen Carnahan, pastor of High Street Congregational Church in Auburn, Maine. If you feel inspired by what you hear, you're invited to join us in person for worship services every Sunday morning, starting at 10 o'clock. Of course, you can always listen to Steve's sermons on the web. New sermons are posted every Monday by midday. Please explore this website for more information about our church, or visit our Facebook page at High Street Congregational Church, UCC, where you'll find the video version of Steve's sermons as well. We hope that God's presence will be known to you every hour of every day. May God's blessings rest upon you now and always. See you next week.